My dear listeners, my name is Evelyn, and I'm sitting here in my quiet living room tonight, holding an old photo album that tells the story of a family that once was. The faces smiling back at me from these yellowed photographs seem like strangers now, though they share my blood, my DNA, my history. Tonight, I want to share with you the most painful and yet most liberating story of my life. It was the day my family walked away from me that I truly learned the meaning of survival. I was left for dead, but somehow I'm still here, and I'm stronger than I ever imagined possible. You know, when people talk about betrayal, they often think of strangers, enemies, or acquaintances who let them down. But the deepest wounds, the ones that cut straight to your soul, those come from the people you trust most in this world. The people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. The people who promise to be there through sickness and health, through good times and bad, your family, your own flesh and blood. I never expected to be sitting here at 78 years old, talking about abandonment and survival. When I was younger, I believed with every fiber of my being that family was everything. I believed that no matter what storms life threw our way, we would weather them together. I believed that love was thicker than blood, stronger than any challenge, more enduring than any hardship. Oh, how naive I was. How beautifully, tragically naive. The pain of abandonment is something that cuts deeper than any physical wound. When a stranger hurts you, you can understand it. You can rationalize it. You can say to yourself, well, they don't know me, they don't owe me anything. But when your own children, the babies you carried in your womb, the little ones you rocked to sleep, the teenagers you worried about and guided through life's challenges, when they turn their backs on you in your darkest hour, it's a pain that has no comparison. I want you to think for a moment about the people in your life who you believe would never abandon you, the ones you're certain would be there if you needed them most. Hold that feeling, that certainty, that trust. Now imagine discovering that everything you believed about their love was wrong. Imagine being in your most vulnerable state, your most desperate need, and having them simply walk away as if you never mattered at all. That's what happened to me, and for the longest time, I thought it would destroy me. I thought that kind of betrayal was something a person couldn't survive. But I'm here to tell you that sometimes being left for dead is exactly what you need to discover how truly alive you can be. Sometimes, the people who abandon you are doing you the greatest favor of your life, even though it doesn't feel that way at the time. Tonight, I'm going to take you through my journey from abandonment to empowerment, from being left behind to finding myself. I'm going to share with you how the worst thing that ever happened to me became the catalyst for the best years of my life. Because you see, my dear listeners, I learned that when everyone else gives up on you, you have two choices. You can give up on yourself, or you can become your own hero. I chose to become my own hero, and it made all the difference. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a time when my world was painted in the warm colors of family love and togetherness. I was born in 1946, the middle child of 5 children, in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. My parents, Robert and Mary, were what you'd call good, honest, hard-working people. Daddy worked at the steel mill, and Mama took care of us kids and kept the house running like a well-oiled machine. We didn't have much money, but we had something that felt more valuable than gold. We had each other. Growing up, our little house on Maple Street was always filled with noise and laughter. My older brother James was the responsible one, always looking out for the rest of us. My younger sister Patricia was the baby, spoiled and sweet, with curls that bounced when she ran. Then there was my youngest brother Michael, born when I was already 10 years old, who became like my own little baby to care for. And my other sister, Carol, just 2 years younger than me, was my best friend and constant companion. Sundays were our sacred family time. After church, we'd all gather around Mama's big wooden table for dinner. The smell of her pot roast would fill the entire house, mixing with the sound of our voices as we shared stories from the week. Daddy would tell us about the characters at the mill, Mama would update us on the neighborhood gossip, and we kids would chatter about school and friends and all the important things that seemed so significant then. I remember thinking, even as a young girl, that this was what real love looked like. The way Mama would stay up all night when one of us was sick, pressing cool washcloths to our fevered foreheads. The way Daddy would work overtime during the holidays to make sure we each had something special under the Christmas tree. The way we'd all pile into the living room on Friday nights to watch the Ed Sullivan Show together, fighting over who got to sit in Daddy's big chair with him. Family loyalty wasn't just expected in our house, it was the foundation of everything we believed in. Mama used to say, "Blood is thicker than water, and family is forever." She taught us that no matter what happened in the outside world, no matter what fights we might have or disagreements we might face, we always had each other to fall back on. We were taught that family meant never having to face anything alone. When I turned 18, I married my high school sweetheart, Thomas. He was a good man, or at least I thought he was at the time, with kind eyes and a gentle way about him that made me feel safe and protected. We had a small wedding in my parents' backyard, with all my brothers and sisters there to celebrate with us. I remember dancing with Daddy that night, and he whispered in my ear, "You'll always be my little girl, Evie. No matter what happens, you can always come home." Thomas and I moved into a small apartment just 6 blocks away from my childhood home. I wanted to stay close to my family, to remain part of that tight-knit circle that had defined my entire life. Within 2 years, I was pregnant with our first child, a beautiful baby girl we named Jennifer. 2 years after that came our son, Robert, named after my father. And 3 years later, our youngest, Michael, completed our little family. Those early years of motherhood were some of the happiest of my life. I threw myself into being the kind of mother that mine had been: devoted, loving, always putting my children's needs before my own. I made sure they knew they were loved, that they were safe, that they could count on me for anything. I attended every school play, every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference. I helped with homework, bandaged scraped knees, and stayed up all night when they were sick, just like my mama had done for me. My own family remained a constant source of support during those years. When Jennifer was born, my sister Patricia moved in with us for 2 weeks to help me adjust to motherhood. When Robert broke his arm falling out of a tree, my brother James drove us to the hospital and stayed with us through the entire ordeal. When Thomas lost his job for 3 months, my parents helped us with groceries and made sure we didn't lose our apartment. This was the family I thought I knew. This was the foundation I believed would never crumble. We celebrated birthdays together, holidays together, milestones together. When my children were small, Sunday dinners expanded to include Thomas and our little ones, and that old wooden table somehow stretched to accommodate our growing family. My children grew up with the same sense of family loyalty that I had, surrounded by aunts and uncles and grandparents who doted on them. But looking back now with the wisdom of age and experience, I can see the cracks that were forming even then. Little things that I chose to ignore or explain away, because they didn't fit with my picture of what family should be. Like the way my sister Carol would sometimes make subtle comments about my parenting choices, disguised as helpful suggestions. Or how my brother James would offer advice about our finances that felt more like judgment than support. As my children grew older, I began to notice changes in them too. Jennifer, who had been such a sweet and affectionate little girl, became distant and moody as a teenager. She'd roll her eyes when I'd try to hug her or tell her I loved her. Robert developed a streak of independence that sometimes felt more like rebellion. He'd argue with me about rules and boundaries, questioning why he had to follow my guidance when his friends seemed to have so much more freedom. I told myself this was normal. All teenagers go through difficult phases. All families have their challenges. I believed that the love we'd built over the years was strong enough to weather any storm. I believed that the foundation we'd laid in those early years would hold us together no matter what. Thomas and I had our struggles too, though I tried to keep them private. After 20 years of marriage, the spark that had brought us together seemed to be fading. He worked long hours and came home tired and irritable. Our conversations became more about logistics, paying bills, managing schedules, dealing with the children's activities, and less about dreams and hopes and the future we were building together. But still, I held on to my faith in family. I believed that love could overcome anything. I believed that the bonds we'd forged were unbreakable. I believed that when the chips were down, when life got really difficult, we'd all come together, just like we always had. I believed that family meant forever, just like Mama had taught me all those years ago. Over the years, I began to notice the cracks in the family growing wider. Little things like my children pulling away, my husband becoming more distant, my siblings seeming less available when I needed them. But I refused to see it for what it was. I made excuses, rationalized their behavior, and convinced myself that nothing could break the bonds we'd built. I believed that no matter what happened, we were family, and family stuck together through everything. How wrong I was. How completely, devastatingly wrong I was about the people I loved most in this world. It was a Tuesday morning in October of 2004 when my world began to crumble. I remember the date so clearly because it was the day after my 58th birthday, and I had been feeling so grateful for my health, my family, and all the blessings in my life. I woke up that morning with what I thought was just a bad headache, the kind that comes from too much celebration and not enough sleep. But as the hours passed, that headache became something much more sinister. The pain started behind my left eye and spread like wildfire through my skull. Within hours, I was nauseous, dizzy, and struggling to see clearly. Thomas was at work, and my children were all busy with their own lives. Jennifer was 26 and working as a nurse, Robert was 24 and had just started his own business, and Michael was 21 and finishing college. I didn't want to bother any of them with what I assumed was just a migraine. But by evening, I knew something was seriously wrong. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced, and I was having trouble forming words properly. When Thomas came home and found me collapsed on the bathroom floor, he rushed me to the emergency room. That night changed everything. The doctors ran test after test, and the results were devastating. I had suffered a stroke, and the damage to my brain was significant. The next few weeks were a blur of hospital rooms, medical procedures, and frightening conversations with doctors who used words I didn't understand. They talked about blood clots and brain damage, about rehabilitation and long-term care. They explained that I would need months, maybe years, of therapy to regain my speech and motor functions. They said I might never fully recover, that I would need help with basic daily activities for the foreseeable future. I remember lying in that hospital bed, frightened and confused, waiting for my family to rally around me the way they always had. I expected them to take turns staying with me, to advocate for my care, to research treatment options, and be my support system through this terrifying journey. After all, this was what families did for each other. This was what I had always done for them. Jennifer came to visit me twice during my 2-week hospital stay. Both visits were brief, maybe 30 minutes each. She would stand at the foot of my bed, asking how I was feeling in a polite but distant way, as if I were an acquaintance rather than the mother who had raised her, loved her, and been there for every important moment of her life. She seemed uncomfortable, eager to leave, always mentioning how busy she was at work, how many patients were depending on her. During her second visit, I tried to talk to her about my fears, about how scared I was about the future and what this illness might mean for our family. I reached out to hold her hand, and she pulled away, telling me that I needed to stay positive and focus on getting better. She said the doctors were optimistic, that I was strong, and that everything would work out fine. Then she looked at her watch and said she had to go. Robert visited me 3 times, but each visit felt more like an obligation than a desire to be there for his mother. He would sit in the chair beside my bed, scrolling through his phone or talking about his business ventures. When I tried to discuss my treatment plan or ask for his help in understanding what the doctors were telling me, he would nod absently and give generic responses like, "That sounds good, Mom," or, "I'm sure you'll figure it out." The most heartbreaking moment came when I asked Robert if he could help me organize my medical records and insurance paperwork. I was still struggling with my speech and fine motor skills, and the administrative side of my illness felt overwhelming. He looked annoyed and said, "Mom, I'm trying to get my business off the ground. I can't take time away from that right now. Can't you ask the hospital social worker to help you with that stuff?" Michael, my youngest, came to see me only once during my entire hospital stay. He seemed genuinely upset to see me in such a weakened state, but when I asked if he could come by more often or help me when I got home, he said college was really demanding and he couldn't afford to fall behind in his classes. He promised he would visit more once the semester ended, but I could see in his eyes that he was already pulling away, already creating distance between himself and this new reality of having a sick mother. Thomas was there every day, but even his presence felt different. He would sit beside my bed reading the newspaper or watching television, occasionally asking how I was feeling but never really engaging with the emotional weight of what we were facing together. When the doctors explained my prognosis and the long road of recovery ahead, he would nod and ask practical questions about insurance coverage and discharge dates. But he never asked how I was coping emotionally or what I needed from him as my husband and partner. The loneliness I felt during those 2 weeks in the hospital was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Here I was, facing the most frightening and uncertain time of my life, and the people I had loved and cared for with every fiber of my being seemed to view my illness as an inconvenience. They showed up physically, but emotionally they were already gone. When I was finally discharged, the reality of my situation became even more clear. I needed help with basic tasks like cooking, cleaning, and managing my medications. My left side was still weak, my speech was slurred, and I tired easily. The doctors had arranged for a home health aide to come 3 times a week, but I needed family support for the times when professional help wasn't available. I thought that my family would step up once I was home. I thought that seeing me struggle in my own house, in the place where I had cared for all of them for so many years, would wake them up to how much I needed them. But instead, their absence became even more pronounced. Jennifer would call once a week, always at times when she knew the conversations would be brief because she was between shifts or had other commitments. She would ask how I was doing, and when I would try to tell her about my struggles with physical therapy or my frustration with simple tasks that used to be easy, she would cut me off with advice like, "You just need to stay positive, Mom," or, "The doctors said you're doing well, so don't worry about it." When I called Jennifer one evening, crying because I had fallen in the shower and couldn't get up for 20 minutes, she listened impatiently and then said, "Mom, you need to be more careful. Maybe you should consider one of those life alert buttons." When I asked if she could come by more often to check on me, she said, "Mom, you've been independent your whole life. You're stronger than you think. You don't need me hovering over you all the time." That conversation was like a knife to my heart. Here I was, the woman who had stayed up all night when she had pneumonia as a child, who had driven her to every dance class and soccer practice, who had helped her through her divorce and been there for every crisis in her adult life, and she was telling me that I didn't need her. Robert's response was even more devastating. When I asked him to help me with grocery shopping and some basic household maintenance that I couldn't manage with my limited mobility, he told me he was too busy getting his business established. He said, "Mom, I'm at a crucial point in my career right now. I can't take time away from building my future. Can't you hire someone to help you with that stuff?" The casual way he dismissed my needs, as if I were asking for a favor rather than basic family support during a medical crisis, showed me just how much our relationship had changed. This was the little boy I had rocked to sleep, the teenager I had helped with homework every night, the young man I had co-signed loans for and supported through every challenge. And now, when I needed him most, I was an inconvenience to his business plans. Michael's abandonment was perhaps the most painful because he had always been my baby, the one I felt closest to. When I called him at college to tell him how isolated and frightened I felt, he listened for a few minutes and then said, "Mom, I know this is hard, but I'm really stressed about my finals right now. Can I call you back later?" He never called back. The loneliness during those first months after my stroke was crushing. I would sit in my living room, struggling to hold a book steady enough to read, listening to the silence of a house that used to be filled with family laughter and conversation. The phone would ring occasionally, but it was usually appointment reminders from doctors' offices or telemarketers, not the voices of the people I loved most. I began to realize that my family saw my illness not as something we would face together, but as my problem to solve alone. They had moved on with their lives, and my stroke was simply an inconvenience that they hoped would resolve itself quickly so they could return to their normal routines. The woman who had been the center of their universe for decades had become someone they preferred to avoid. If I thought the first few months after my stroke were difficult, I had no idea what was coming. As my condition worsened instead of improved, and as the reality set in that my recovery would be long and uncertain, My family's true colors began to show in ways that still take my breath away when I think about them today. 6 months after my stroke, I was still struggling with basic daily activities. My speech had improved somewhat, but I still slurred my words when I was tired, which was most of the time. My left arm remained weak, making it difficult to cook, clean, or even dress myself properly. The doctors had warned that some stroke patients never fully recover, and it was becoming clear that I might be one of them. The home health aide who came 3 times a week was professional and kind, but she was there to help with medical care and basic physical therapy, not to provide the emotional support and family connection that I desperately needed. The rest of the time, I was alone with my fears, my pain, and the growing realization that the people I had devoted my life to caring for had no intention of returning that care when I needed it most. It was during this time that Thomas began to change in ways that shocked me to my core. The man I had been married to for 32 years, the father of my children, the person who had promised to love me in sickness and in health, began to treat me like a burden rather than his wife. He would come home from work and barely acknowledge my presence. When I would try to talk to him about my day, my struggles, or my fears about the future, he would grunt non-committal responses and turn on the television. One evening in March, I had fallen again while trying to make dinner. I was lying on the kitchen floor, unable to get up, when Thomas came home. Instead of rushing to help me or showing concern for my well-being, he sighed heavily and said, "Evelyn, you need to be more careful. I can't keep dealing with this every day." He helped me to the couch, but his touch was rough and impatient, and he spent the rest of the evening in his workshop, avoiding me completely. That night, lying in bed beside a man who felt like a stranger, I realized that my marriage was over in everything but name. Thomas had mentally checked out of our relationship the moment my stroke made me less than the independent, capable woman he had married. He didn't want a wife who needed care. He wanted a wife who could take care of him. But the worst was yet to come. In April, exactly 7 months after my stroke, I had another medical emergency that would reveal just how completely my family had abandoned me. I was alone in the house when I began experiencing severe chest pains and difficulty breathing. Terrified that I might be having a heart attack, I managed to call 911 before collapsing on the living room floor. The paramedics arrived within minutes and rushed me to the hospital, where tests revealed that I had developed a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in my lung that was potentially life-threatening. The doctors explained that this was a serious complication that could have killed me if I hadn't gotten medical attention when I did. They said I would need to be hospitalized for at least a week while they administered blood thinners and monitored my condition. From my hospital bed, I called Thomas to tell him what had happened. His response still haunts me today. Instead of asking how I was or expressing concern for my well-being, the first words out of his mouth were, "How long are you going to be in the hospital?" "I have a golf tournament this weekend that I've been planning to attend for months." I was so shocked by his reaction that I couldn't speak for several seconds. Here I was, having nearly died from a blood clot, and my husband of 32 years was worried about his golf tournament. When I finally found my voice, I said, "Thomas, I almost died today. The doctors say this is very serious." His response was, "Well, you're fine now, aren't you? The doctors will take care of you." That conversation was the beginning of the end of any illusion I had left about my marriage. Thomas visited me once during my week-long hospital stay, and that visit lasted less than 15 minutes. He stood at the foot of my bed, asked a few perfunctory questions about my discharge date, and then left, saying he had errands to run. But if Thomas's betrayal was devastating, my children's response to this second medical crisis was absolutely soul-crushing. I called Jennifer from the hospital to let her know what had happened, expecting that surely this time, this brush with death, would wake her up to how much I needed her support. Jennifer listened to my explanation of the pulmonary embolism and the potential seriousness of my condition, and then said, "Mom, I'm sure you'll be fine. You're in good hands with the doctors." When I asked if she could come visit me, she said she was working double shifts that week and couldn't get away. When I pressed her, explaining how frightened and alone I felt, she became irritated and said, "Mom, you're being dramatic. It's not like you're dying. You just need to focus on getting better." The coldness in her voice, the complete lack of empathy or concern, was like a physical blow. This was my daughter, the little girl I had sung to sleep every night, the teenager I had comforted through heartbreaks, the young woman I had supported through nursing school. And she was dismissing my medical emergency as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. When I called Robert to tell him about the blood clot, his response was even worse. He listened impatiently as I explained what had happened, and then said, "Mom, I can't visit you in the hospital because I'm in the middle of a big business deal that requires my full attention. I'm sure you understand. This could really change my life financially." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, "Robert, I almost died today. I'm your mother. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" His response will haunt me for the rest of my life. "Mom, you're being selfish. You've always been independent and strong. You don't need me to hold your hand through every medical problem. I have my own life to worry about." Selfish. He called me selfish for wanting my son to care that I had nearly died, for wanting some support during the most frightening time of my life. The word hit me like a slap across the face, and I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. But the final betrayal, the one that broke my heart completely, came from Michael. My youngest son, the one I had always felt closest to, the one who had seemed genuinely upset during my stroke recovery, delivered the most devastating blow of all. When I called Michael to tell him about the pulmonary embolism, he was quiet for a long time after I finished explaining what had happened. I thought maybe he was processing the seriousness of the situation, maybe feeling guilty about how absent he had been during my recovery. But when he finally spoke, his words shattered what was left of my faith in family love. "Mom," he said, his voice tired and distant, "I need to be honest with you about something. This whole thing with your stroke and now this blood clot, it's really affecting my mental health. I'm seeing a counselor at school, and she says I need to set boundaries with family members who are causing me stress. I think I need to take a break from our relationship for a while." I was so stunned that I couldn't respond immediately. My youngest child, the baby I had held and rocked and loved with every fiber of my being, was telling me that my medical crises were affecting his mental health and that he needed to take a break from being my son. "Michael," I whispered, "I'm your mother. I almost died today. I'm scared and alone and I need my family." His response was calm and measured, as if he had rehearsed it. "I understand that you're going through a difficult time, but I can't sacrifice my own well-being to take care of you. I need to focus on my education and my future. I'm sure you'll figure things out." And then he hung up. My baby, my youngest child, hung up on me while I was lying in a hospital bed, having nearly died from a blood clot, because taking care of his mother was too stressful for him to handle. I lay in that hospital bed for the next 6 days, completely alone. No visitors, no flowers, no phone calls from family members checking on my progress. The nurses began to comment on how quiet my room was compared to other patients who had constant streams of visitors. One young nurse, probably about Jennifer's age, asked me if I had any children. When I told her I had 3, she looked confused and said, "Oh, I just assumed you didn't have family nearby since no one ever comes to see you." That comment broke something inside me that I don't think ever fully healed. The realization that strangers could see what I had been trying to deny, that I had been completely abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me most in this world. During those 6 days alone in the hospital, I had plenty of time to think about my life, my relationships, and the choices I had made. I realized that I had spent 30-plus years pouring all of my love, energy, and resources into people who saw me as nothing more than a service provider. When I could no longer provide the services they expected, when I became the one who needed care instead of the one who gave it, they simply discarded me. The day I was discharged from the hospital, Thomas picked me up but didn't speak to me during the entire drive home. When we got to the house, he helped me inside and then immediately left to play golf, leaving me alone to manage my medications and recovery by myself. That evening, sitting in my living room with a pile of discharge papers and prescription bottles, I made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. I was done waiting for my family to remember that they loved me. I was done making excuses for their behavior and hoping that things would go back to the way they used to be. I was done being a victim of their neglect and abandonment. It was time to save myself, because clearly, no one else was going to do it. That night, when I came home from the hospital after the blood clot, sitting alone in my living room with those prescription bottles scattered on the coffee table, I faced a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could either give up and let the abandonment destroy me, or I could fight like hell to save myself. The woman I had been before my stroke might have continued waiting for her family to come around, making excuses for their behavior, and slowly withering away from loneliness and neglect. But the woman I was becoming that night was different. She was a fighter. The first thing I did was cry. I cried for hours, mourning not just the family I thought I had, but the version of myself that had believed love was unconditional and that family meant forever. I cried for the 32 years I had spent with a man who saw me as disposable the moment I became inconvenient. I cried for the children I had raised with such devotion, only to discover that their love came with conditions I could no longer meet. I cried until I had no tears left, and then I got angry. Anger, I discovered, was a much more useful emotion than sadness. Sadness made me want to curl up in bed and disappear. Anger made me want to prove them all wrong. Anger gave me energy and determination, and a fierce desire to show them that they had thrown away something precious, and that their loss was going to be my gain. The next morning, I called my doctor's office and scheduled appointments with every specialist they recommended. If my family wasn't going to advocate for my health, then I would become my own advocate. I researched my conditions online, printed out articles about stroke recovery and blood clot prevention, and prepared lists of questions for every medical appointment. I also called a lawyer. I had been married to Thomas for 32 years, and I had legal rights that I was going to exercise. I wasn't going to let him continue living in our house, enjoying the benefits of marriage, while treating me like an unwanted roommate. If he wanted to act like a bachelor, then he could live like one. The lawyer, a kind woman named Sarah, who specialized in divorce cases involving medical issues, listened to my story with genuine compassion. She explained my rights regarding property division, spousal support, and healthcare coverage. For the first time in months, I felt like someone was actually on my side, someone who understood that what was happening to me was wrong and that I had options. But the most important decision I made during those first few weeks after the hospital was to find a therapist. I had never been to therapy before. In my generation, we were taught to handle our problems privately, to keep family business within the family, and to solve our own emotional issues without outside help. But my old ways of thinking had gotten me into this mess, and I needed new tools to get myself out. Dr. Patricia Martinez was a psychologist who specialized in family dynamics and medical trauma. Our first session was awkward and difficult. I felt embarrassed telling a stranger about my family's abandonment, worried that she would judge me or think I was exaggerating the situation. But Dr. 16 Martinez listened without judgment, asked thoughtful questions, and helped me begin to see my situation clearly. "Evelyn," she said during our third session, "you've spent your entire adult life defining yourself through your relationships with other people. You were Thomas's wife, Jennifer's mother, Robert's mother, Michael's mother. But who are you when you take away all those roles? Who is Evelyn when she's not taking care of everyone else?" That question hit me like a thunderbolt. I realized that I had no idea who I was as an individual person. My identity had been so wrapped up in being a caregiver that I had never developed a sense of self outside of those relationships. No wonder I felt so lost when my family abandoned me. I literally didn't know who I was without them. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my family's behavior wasn't really about my illness or my neediness. It was about their own inability to handle discomfort, their selfishness, and their failure to develop empathy and emotional maturity. She helped me see that I had enabled their behavior for years by always being the one to give, to sacrifice, to put their needs before my own. "You taught them that your needs don't matter," she explained. "Every time you put their comfort ahead of your own well-being, every time you solved their problems without expecting anything in return, every time you accepted less than you deserved, you were training them to see you as someone whose feelings and needs weren't important." This was a difficult truth to accept, but it was also liberating. If I had trained them to treat me badly, then I could also train them to treat me well, or I could simply remove myself from their lives entirely and find people who already knew how to treat others with respect and kindness. Physical therapy became another battlefield in my fight for independence. My insurance covered twice-a-week sessions with a physical therapist, but I quickly realized that wasn't going to be enough if I wanted to regain my strength and mobility. I hired a private trainer who specialized in working with stroke patients, paying for the sessions out of my own savings. Marcus was a former athlete who had retrained as a physical therapist after his own father suffered a stroke. He was tough but encouraging, pushing me to work harder than I thought I could, while also celebrating every small victory along the way. When I could barely lift a 2-pound weight with my left arm, he cheered as if I had just won an Olympic medal. "Mrs. Evelyn," he would say during our sessions, "your family doesn't define your worth. Your limitations don't define your potential. The only person who gets to decide what you're capable of is you." Those words became my mantra. Every morning when I woke up, I would repeat them to myself as I struggled through my exercises. When the loneliness threatened to overwhelm me, I would remember that my worth wasn't determined by whether my children called or whether my husband showed me affection. My worth was inherent, and I was the only one who could diminish it by giving up on myself. Slowly, painfully, but steadily, I began to improve. My left arm grew stronger, my balance became more stable, my speech cleared up until you could barely tell I had ever had a stroke. But more importantly, my confidence grew. Every physical milestone I reached was proof that I was capable of more than my family had given me credit for. The breakthrough moment came about 4 months into my recovery journey. I was at the grocery store, managing my shopping cart with one hand while carrying my purse and a shopping list when I ran into my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. She was an elderly woman who had always been kind to me, and she seemed genuinely surprised to see me out and about. "Evelyn," she said, "you look wonderful. I heard about your stroke, and I was so worried about you. How are you managing? Is your family helping you with everything?" Without thinking, I answered honestly, "Actually, Mrs. Henderson, I'm managing just fine on my own. My family has been busy with their own lives, so I've learned to take care of myself, and you know what? I'm stronger than I ever thought I was." As I said those words, I realized they were true. I was managing on my own. I was taking care of myself. I was stronger than I had ever thought possible. The woman who had once been terrified of being alone, who had defined herself entirely through her relationships with others, was standing in a grocery store, completely independent and surprisingly content. That evening, I called Dr. Martinez to tell her about my realization. "I think I'm ready for the next phase," I told her. "I'm ready to stop trying to fix my relationships with my family and start building a life that doesn't depend on them at all." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Evelyn, what you just said represents months of growth and healing. You're not the same woman who walked into my office 6 months ago. You've reclaimed your power." Reclaimed my power. That phrase resonated with me deeply. For so many years, I had given my power away to other people, allowing them to determine my worth, my happiness, and my sense of purpose. But stroke by stroke, therapy session by therapy session, physical therapy appointment by physical therapy appointment, I had been taking that power back. I started making decisions based on what I wanted, not what would make other people happy or comfortable. I rearranged my house to better accommodate my physical needs, getting rid of furniture and decorations that reminded me of my old life and replacing them with things that reflected the woman I was becoming. I joined a stroke support group at the local community center, where I met other people who understood the challenges I was facing. Many of them had supportive families, which sometimes made me feel envious, but I also met several people who had been abandoned by their loved ones and had found ways to build fulfilling lives anyway. There was Margaret, who had been divorced by her husband 6 months after her stroke because he couldn't handle being married to someone with a disability. There was Frank, whose adult children had moved him into a nursing home against his will because they didn't want to deal with his care needs. There was Linda, whose sisters had stopped speaking to her after she asked for help during her recovery. At first, hearing these stories made me feel sad and angry on behalf of these wonderful people who had been treated so poorly. But gradually, I began to see something else. They were all thriving despite their abandonment. They had found new sources of joy, new purposes, new relationships. They had proven that family betrayal doesn't have to be a death sentence. Margaret had started a blog about stroke recovery that had thousands of readers around the world. Frank had become an advocate for nursing home reform and was working with legislators to improve care standards. Linda had gone back to school at age 62 to become a social worker, specializing in helping elderly people navigate family conflicts. These people had taken their pain and transformed it into purpose. They had refused to let their families' failures define their futures. They had become their own heroes, and they inspired me to do the same. I realized that the only person who could save me was me. I couldn't wait for my family to step in and rescue me from my loneliness and fear. I couldn't wait for them to suddenly develop empathy and realize how badly they had treated me. I had to be my own advocate, my own support system, my own source of love and validation. And you know what? I was really good at it. After 18 months of therapy, physical rehabilitation, and soul-searching, I had transformed into a woman I barely recognized. The frightened, abandoned stroke victim who had begged her family for scraps of attention was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. I was stronger, healthier, and more independent than I had been in years. But there was still unfinished business that needed to be addressed. My family had been calling occasionally during my recovery, checking in with brief, superficial conversations that felt more like obligation than genuine concern. Thomas still lived in our house, though we barely spoke to each other and slept in separate bedrooms. My children would call every few weeks, asking how I was doing in voices that suggested they hoped for quick, positive answers that wouldn't require any real engagement on their part. During one of my therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez, I expressed my frustration with these hollow interactions. "They act like nothing happened," I told her, "like they didn't abandon me when I needed them most, like their behavior was perfectly normal and acceptable." "Doctor," Martinez leaned forward in her chair. "Evelyn, have you ever directly confronted them about how their actions affected you? Have you told them specifically what they did wrong and how it made you feel?" I realized that I hadn't. I had been hurt, angry, and disappointed, but I had never actually sat them down and explained how their abandonment had devastated me. Part of me had been afraid of their reactions, afraid that confronting them might drive them away completely. But after 18 months of learning to value myself, I understood that their presence in my life was meaningless if it was built on pretending that their betrayal had never happened. "I think it's time for me to tell them the truth," I said. "Not because I expect them to change or apologize, but because I need them to know that I see them clearly now. I need them to understand that their actions had consequences, and that I'm not the same person they think they can treat however they want." Dr. Martinez smiled. "That sounds like the voice of a woman who has found her power. Remember, the goal isn't to get a specific reaction from them. The goal is to speak your truth and maintain your dignity, regardless of how they respond." I decided to start with a family dinner. I called each of my children and invited them to come to the house on a Sunday afternoon for what I told them was an important family discussion. I also informed Thomas that he needed to be present. I didn't give them details about what I wanted to discuss, just that it was important and that I expected all of them to be there. Jennifer tried to get out of it, saying she had plans with friends. "Mom, can't we just talk on the phone? I'm really busy this weekend." "No, Jennifer," I said firmly. "This needs to be done in person, and it needs to be done with everyone present. If you're too busy to give your mother 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon, then you need to examine your priorities." My tone surprised her. The old Evelyn would have accepted her excuse and rescheduled around her convenience. This new Evelyn wasn't asking for her time. I was requiring it. Robert also tried to avoid the meeting, claiming he had a business obligation. "Mom, can we do this next month? I'm really swamped right now." "Robert," I said, "you've been too swamped to be there for me for the past 2 years. You'll make time for this, or you'll have to live with the consequences of that choice." Something in my voice must have convinced him that I was serious, because he agreed to come. Michael was the most resistant. "Mom, I told you I needed space from family drama. Can't you respect that?" "Michael," I replied, "what you're going to hear isn't drama, it's truth. And if you're too fragile to handle the truth about your own behavior, then you're not the man I thought I raised." That Sunday afternoon, I spent hours preparing for the conversation. I wrote down everything I wanted to say, organizing my thoughts so I wouldn't forget important points or get derailed by their inevitable defensiveness. I cooked a simple meal, not because I wanted to take care of them, but because I wanted them to be comfortable enough to really listen to what I had to say. When they all arrived, the atmosphere was tense. They clearly suspected that something significant was about to happen, but they had no idea what they were in for. We ate dinner with minimal conversation, everyone seeming to wait for me to reveal the purpose of the gathering. After we finished eating, I cleared my throat and looked around the table at these 4 people who had once been the center of my universe. I asked you all here today because there are things that need to be said. Things that should have been said a long time ago, but I was too hurt and too confused to find the words. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Jennifer and Robert exchanged glances. Michael stared at his plate, avoiding eye contact. 2 years ago, I had a stroke that changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. But it wasn't the stroke itself that nearly destroyed me. It was discovering how little my own family cared about my well-being when I needed them most. Jennifer started to interrupt. "Mom, that's not fair. We all cared about you. We just—" "No," I said firmly, holding up my hand. "You're going to listen to what I have to say without interrupting, and then you can respond however you choose. But first, you're going to hear the truth about what you did to me." I turned to Jennifer first. "Jennifer, you're a nurse. You know better than anyone how frightening and overwhelming a stroke can be for a patient and their family. But when your own mother was lying in a hospital bed, scared and confused and needing emotional support, you visited me twice in 2 weeks. Twice. When I tried to tell you how frightened I was, you told me to stay positive and pulled away from me like I was contagious." Jennifer's face flushed red. "Mom, I was working double shifts. I was exhausted. You found time for everything else in your life," I continued. "You found time for your friends, your hobbies, your social activities. The only thing you couldn't find time for was your mother's medical crisis. And when I had the blood clot and nearly died, you told me I was being dramatic." I turned to Robert. "Robert, when I asked you to help me with basic tasks like grocery shopping and household maintenance, you told me you were too busy building your business to help your disabled mother. You told me to hire someone else to take care of me, as if I were a client rather than the woman who raised you." Robert's jaw tightened. "Mom, I was at a crucial point in my career. I couldn't just drop everything." "You didn't need to drop everything," I replied. "You needed to show up for your mother. You needed to demonstrate that my well-being mattered more than your convenience. But you couldn't do that, because you've never learned to put anyone else's needs before your own." Then I looked at Michael, my youngest, my baby, and you, Michael. You told me that my medical crisis was affecting your mental health and that you needed to take a break from our relationship. You hung up on me while I was in the hospital, having nearly died from a blood clot, because taking care of your mother was too stressful for you to handle. Michael's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, my therapist said I needed to set boundaries." "Your therapist was wrong?" I said quietly. "There's a difference between setting healthy boundaries and abandoning your mother during a medical emergency. What you did wasn't self-care, it was selfishness." Finally, I turned to Thomas. "And you, Thomas, my husband of 32 years, the man who promised to love me in sickness and in health, you treated my stroke like a personal inconvenience. You showed more concern about missing your golf tournament than you did about my pulmonary embolism. You emotionally checked out of our marriage the moment I became someone who needed care instead of someone who provided it." Thomas looked angry. "Evelyn, you're being unfair. I was dealing with my own stress about your illness." "No, Thomas," I said. "You were dealing with your disappointment that your wife was no longer convenient. You were dealing with your resentment that I could no longer take care of you the way I always had. You never once asked how I was feeling emotionally. You never once offered genuine comfort or support. You treated me like a roommate you were annoyed with, not like the woman you had shared 32 years of marriage with." The room was completely silent. I could see the shock on their faces, the discomfort, the beginning stirrings of defensiveness. But I wasn't finished. "For 18 months, I tried to understand your behavior. I made excuses for you. I told myself that maybe I was asking for too much, that maybe I was being too needy, that maybe I needed to be more independent and not rely on family support during the biggest medical crisis of my life. I paused, letting that sink in. But then I started therapy, and I began to understand what had really happened. You all abandoned me because you had never learned to love unconditionally. Your love for me was based on what I could do for you, not on who I was as a person. When I could no longer be the caregiver, the problem solver, the person who put everyone else's needs before her own, you decided I wasn't worth your time anymore. Jennifer was crying now. Mom, that's not true. We love you. No, I said gently but firmly. You love the version of me that served your needs. You love the mother who never asked for anything in return, who always put your comfort ahead of her own well-being, who made your lives easier without expecting you to make any sacrifices for her. But you don't love me enough to be there when I need you. You don't love me enough to put my needs before your convenience. You don't love me enough to treat me with the same care and devotion that I showed you for decades. Robert stood up abruptly. Mom, this is ridiculous. You're being manipulative and guilt-tripping us. No, Robert, I said calmly. I'm telling you the truth about your behavior, and you're uncomfortable hearing it. That's not manipulation. That's accountability. I stood up as well, feeling stronger and more centered than I had in years. I'm not telling you this because I want apologies or because I expect you to change. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that your actions had consequences. You didn't just neglect my physical needs during my recovery. You broke my heart. You shattered my faith in family love. You taught me that the people I had devoted my life to caring for saw me as disposable. Thomas was shaking his head. Evelyn, you're blowing this out of proportion. Am I Thomas? I asked. Then explain to me why, when your wife of 32 years nearly died from a blood clot, your first concern was whether it would interfere with your golf tournament. Explain to me how that's proportionate. He couldn't answer. I looked around the table one more time. I want you all to know that I've spent the last 18 months rebuilding my life without depending on any of you. I've learned that I'm stronger, more capable, and more resilient than I ever knew. I've learned that my worth doesn't depend on whether you value me. I've learned that I can be happy and fulfilled even if you never change. The room was heavy with tension and emotion. I could see that my words had hit their mark, that they were finally understanding the gravity of what they had done. But I could also see their defensiveness, their reluctance to accept responsibility, their desire to minimize their actions and make me the problem. The old Evelyn would have ended this conversation by reassuring you that everything was okay, that I forgave you, that we could just move forward and pretend this never happened. I continued. But I'm not the old Evelyn anymore. I'm not going to make this easier for you by pretending that your behavior was acceptable. I walked toward the door, turning back one final time. You're all welcome to stay and finish your dinner. But I'm done enabling your selfishness by pretending that it doesn't hurt me. From now on, if you want a relationship with me, you're going to have to earn it by demonstrating that you actually value me as a person, not just as someone who serves your needs. And with that, I walked out of my own dining room, leaving them to sit with the truth of their actions for the first time in 2 years. The silence that followed my confrontation with my family was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the heavy, uncomfortable silence of conflict or anger. It was the peaceful, liberating silence of truth finally spoken. As I sat in my bedroom that evening, listening to the muffled voices of my family members talking in the dining room below, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, complete and total relief. For the first time since my stroke, I had stopped protecting their feelings at the expense of my own. For the first time in decades, I had put my need for honesty and dignity above their need for comfort and convenience. It felt like taking the deepest breath of my life after being underwater for years. They left that evening without saying goodbye, which told me everything I needed to know about how they had received my words. Jennifer slammed the front door behind her. Robert's car tires squealed as he pulled out of the driveway. Michael didn't even look back at the house. Thomas went straight to his workshop and stayed there until I had gone to bed. Over the next few weeks, their true colors showed even more clearly than they had during my medical crisis. Instead of self-reflection or attempts to make amends, I was met with anger, defensiveness, and blame-shifting that confirmed everything I had said about their character. Jennifer called 3 days later, her voice tight with indignation. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said, and I think you're being completely unfair. I did the best I could during your stroke. I was working full-time and dealing with my own stress. You can't expect me to drop everything in my life every time you have a medical problem." "Jennifer," I said calmly, "I didn't ask you to drop everything in your life. I asked you to show up for your mother during the scariest time of her life. The fact that you can't see the difference between those two things tells me everything I need to know about your priorities." She hung up on me. It would be the last conversation we would have for over a year. Robert's response was even more telling. He sent me a text message, because apparently I wasn't worth a phone call. "Mom, your little speech was very dramatic, but you need to understand that I have responsibilities and commitments that don't revolve around you. I can't put my life on hold every time you need something. That's not how the real world works." I stared at that text message for a long time, marveling at how perfectly it encapsulated everything that was wrong with my relationship with my children. He saw caring for his mother during a medical emergency as putting his life on hold. He saw my need for basic family support as unreasonable demands that didn't fit with how the real world works. I didn't respond to his text. There was nothing left to say. Michael's reaction was perhaps the most painful, but also the most clarifying. He called me crying, apologizing profusely, saying he realized he had made terrible mistakes and wanted to make things right. For a moment, my heart softened, and I thought maybe my confrontation had actually reached him. But as he continued talking, I realized that his tears weren't about genuine remorse for how he had treated me. They were about how guilty my words had made him feel, and how uncomfortable that guilt was for him to carry. "Mom, I feel terrible about what happened. I've been so depressed since our family dinner. My therapist says I need to forgive myself and move on, but I can't stop thinking about what you said." Even his apology was about him. Even his remorse was centered on his own discomfort rather than on the pain he had caused me. He wanted me to absolve him of his guilt so he could feel better, not because he had genuinely understood the impact of his actions. "Michael," I said gently, "I appreciate that you're feeling bad about what happened, but feeling guilty isn't the same as taking responsibility. If you want to make things right between us, you need to show me through your actions that you understand what you did wrong and that you're committed to being a better son going forward." "But how do I do that?" he asked, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. He wanted a quick fix, a simple formula that would repair our relationship without requiring sustained effort or genuine change on his part. "That's something you need to figure out," I told him. "I can't teach you how to love me properly. You're 23 years old. You should already know how to treat people you care about with kindness and respect." He stopped calling after that conversation. Thomas's response was the most predictable of all. He moved out of our bedroom entirely, setting up a bed in his workshop, and began treating me like a hostile roommate. He would grunt acknowledgments when I spoke to him, but otherwise acted as if I didn't exist. It was clear that he was punishing me for having the audacity to call out his behavior. One evening, about a month after the family dinner, I found him packing a suitcase. "Are you leaving?" I asked. "I'm going to stay with my brother for a while," he said without looking at me. "I need some space to think about whether I want to stay married to someone who thinks so little of me." I almost laughed at the irony. "Thomas, I don't think little of you because of who you are. I think little of you because of how you've chosen to treat me. There's a difference." He finally looked at me then, his face hard with resentment. "You've changed, Evelyn. You're not the woman I married." "You're right," I said. "I'm not the woman you married. I'm not the woman who will accept being treated as disposable. I'm not the woman who will pretend that neglect and abandonment are acceptable forms of love. If that's the woman you want to be married to, then you're going to be disappointed." He left that night, and I felt nothing but relief. The divorce process was surprisingly straightforward. Thomas wanted out of the marriage as much as I did, and we were able to reach an agreement without much drama. I kept the house, which I had always loved, and he took most of the financial assets, which was fine with me. I didn't want his money. I wanted my freedom. The silence that followed their departures from my life was initially difficult to adjust to. After decades of centering my life around other people's needs and schedules, I found myself with vast stretches of time that belonged entirely to me. At first, the quiet felt lonely and overwhelming. But gradually, I began to appreciate the peace of not having to manage anyone else's emotions or expectations. I started filling my life with activities and relationships that brought me genuine joy rather than obligation. I joined a book club at the local library, where I met a group of women who became real friends, people who valued my thoughts and opinions, who checked on me when I was unwell, who celebrated my successes without jealousy or resentment. I began volunteering at a literacy center, teaching adults how to read. Working with people who were so grateful for help and support reminded me what healthy relationships looked like. My students appreciated my time and effort, showed up consistently, and treated me with respect and kindness. It was a stark contrast to the family relationships I had endured for so long. I also started traveling, something I had always wanted to do but had never prioritized while I was busy taking care of everyone else. I took a bus tour through New England to see the fall foliage, joined a group trip to visit historical sites in Virginia, and even flew to California to see the Pacific Ocean for the first time in my life. Each trip was a revelation. I discovered that I was excellent company for myself, that I could navigate new places and situations with confidence, and that I genuinely enjoyed my own thoughts and observations. I had spent so many years defining myself through my relationships with other people that I had forgotten how to enjoy my own company. The most transformative experience came when I joined a support group for people who had been estranged from their adult children. I had initially been reluctant to attend, worried that it would be depressing or that I would be judged for cutting ties with my family. But the group turned out to be one of the most healing and empowering experiences of my recovery. There were 12 of us, ranging in age from 45 to 82, and our stories were remarkably similar. We had all been devoted parents who had sacrificed our own needs for our children's well-being, only to discover that our children saw our love as entitlement rather than gift. We had all been abandoned or mistreated by the people we had loved most, and we had all struggled with guilt and self-doubt about our decisions to limit or end contact. But what struck me most about the group was how vibrant and fulfilled these people were. They had channeled their nurturing energy into other relationships and pursuits. They had learned to love themselves with the same devotion they had once shown their ungrateful children. They had proven that family rejection doesn't have to mean a life of loneliness and regret. Margaret, the stroke survivor I had met in my earlier support group, was also part of this estrangement group. She had flourished in the 3 years since her husband had divorced her, building a successful blog that had led to speaking engagements around the country. She had also started dating again and was in a loving relationship with a man who admired her strength and independence. Evelyn, she told me during one of our group sessions, the best thing my family ever did for me was show me who they really were. If they had continued pretending to love me while treating me poorly, I might have wasted the rest of my life trying to earn something that was never available to begin with. Her words resonated deeply with me. I realized that my family's abandonment, as painful as it had been, was actually a gift. It had freed me from the exhausting work of trying to maintain relationships with people who didn't value me. It had given me permission to invest my energy in people and activities that brought me genuine fulfillment. 2 years after my confrontation with my family, I received a call from Jennifer. She was crying and apologetic, saying that she had been going through her own therapy and had realized how badly she had treated me. She wanted to rebuild our relationship and asked if she could come visit me. I listened to her with compassion, but without the desperate hope I once would have felt. "Jennifer," I said, "I appreciate your apology, and I'm glad you're working on yourself. But I need you to understand that an apology isn't enough to repair the damage that was done. If you want a relationship with me, you're going to need to demonstrate through consistent actions over time that you've actually changed." She agreed eagerly, promising to do whatever it took to earn my trust back. But within a few weeks, her old patterns emerged. She would call when it was convenient for her, cancel plans at the last minute when something better came up, and expect me to be grateful for whatever minimal effort she was willing to provide. After 2 months of this, I had another honest conversation with her. "Jennifer, I can see that you want to feel better about our relationship, but you're not actually willing to do the work required to rebuild it. You're still treating my time and feelings as less important than your convenience." She became defensive and angry, accusing me of being unforgiving and holding grudges. "Mom," I apologized. "I'm trying. Why can't you just let the past go?" "Because the past isn't in the past if you're still repeating the same behaviors," I explained. "You're not actually trying to be a better daughter. You're trying to get me to accept the same treatment I always accepted, just with an apology attached." That was the last conversation we had. She went back to her life, and I went back to mine, both of us finally understanding that we wanted different things from a mother-daughter relationship. 3 years after my stroke, on a beautiful spring morning, I was sitting in my garden with a cup of coffee and a good book when I realized something profound. I was happy. Not the desperate, dependent happiness that comes from other people's approval, but the deep, sustainable happiness that comes from living authentically and surrounding yourself with people who genuinely care about your well-being. My life was smaller than it had been when I was married with an extended family, but it was infinitely richer. Every relationship I had was based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Every activity I engaged in brought me joy rather than obligation. Every day belonged to me, and I could fill it with whatever brought me peace and fulfillment. I had learned that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who support you, care for you, and lift you up when you're struggling. I had found my real family among friends who celebrated my victories and comforted me during difficulties, among fellow volunteers who shared my values and appreciated my contributions, among support group members who understood my journey and cheered my progress. Most importantly, I had learned to be my own family. I had learned to love myself with the same devotion I had once shown people who didn't deserve it. I had learned to advocate for my own needs, to protect my own well-being, and to create a life that reflected my values rather than other people's expectations. Being left for dead wasn't the end of me. It was the beginning of something beautiful, something authentic, something entirely mine. It was the beginning of a life where I was the author of my own story, the architect of my own happiness, and the guardian of my own worth. And that, my dear listeners, is the most precious gift anyone can give themselves. The knowledge that they are enough, all by themselves, to create a life worth living.